Good evening, welcome. My name is Craig Kufura. I am the Assistant Director of Public Opinion and Foreign Policy here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. With me tonight is my colleague, Carl Friedhoff. He is the Marshall M. Bhutan Fellow for Asia Studies at the Chicago Council. We're excited to be here with you this evening for a pre-debate briefing on public opinion, polling, and politics. Before we get started, as a reminder, we are on the record this evening. The Council is an independent and nonpartisan platform. The views expressed by individuals on that platform are their own and do not represent institutional positions or the views of the Council. And this program tonight is part of the Lester Crown Center on U.S. Foreign Policy. A generous gift from the Crown from the Crown family supports all of the center's efforts, including the annual Chicago Council survey, programs like this, and the development of digital resources to make the Council's foreign policy content widely accessible across our platforms. If you have a question you'd like to ask or a topic of discussion you'd like us to address, we will be taking audience questions throughout the program at ccga.live. Simply enter ccga.live into your browser, follow the on-screen prompts, and you'll be able to engage with us directly there. We do want this to be as interactive as possible, so we encourage you to participate actively in the discussion. Feel free to engage, vote, and comment on other questions, and continue to interact with our globally minded Council community during the program and through the debate. Tonight, President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden will face off in the second and final presidential debate of 2020. While Election Day itself is 12 days away, the election is already here. Many states have already exceeded their 2016 early vote numbers. As of a few hours ago, the count of votes cast stands at 47.6 million, and there are still nearly 2 weeks to go. By all estimates, turnout this year is going to be historically high. According to 538, 65% of the voting age population is estimated to vote this year. If so, that will be the highest turnout in a US presidential election since 1908. It will certainly be the largest total number of votes cast in US history. The estimate is at 154 million. For comparison, in 2016, we had 137 million votes cast. But before we get to Election Day, there is one more debate. The topics tonight will include the coronavirus, race relations, climate change, and national security. And before the candidates lay out their arguments, we're going to walk through how the public is thinking about some of these critical foreign policy issues. Carl, it's been quite a year so far, and there's a lot to talk about. And it seems like these two candidates don't agree on much of anything. Is the public as divided as the candidates are?
Oh yeah, thanks. And thanks to everyone for joining us, especially all the unfortunate souls who decided that they're going to spend their Thursday evening watching this debate. I assume that many of you had the unfortunate chance to watch the first debate as well. Hopefully this one will go a little bit better now that civility is seemingly going to be enforced on the candidates through cutting their mics. But when we talk about this division within the parties, I'm going to share my screen here to kind of walk through, because this gets a little bit complicated and it covers a lot of the topics that are here. But yeah, this is something we're seeing, that the public is divided on some of these top issues. If we look at the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, you see here on this left column, the overall, it's the #1 threat for the American public. So this is kind of critical threats facing the United States. I probably should have led with that to put this in a little better context. But then, that hides a lot of this. When you start to break it down, you can see for Republicans, the COVID-19 pandemic is not even in the top 5. But for Democrats, it's #1. And so when you look at these overall numbers, it can be a little bit misleading. And, we know that tonight we're going to hear about climate change, right? We're going to hear about racial inequality. We're going to hear probably about foreign interference, given the news that's been broken out on Iran and in Russia yesterday by the FBI and the DOJ, and economic inequality. So a lot of these things are there, but if you look at that list, there's not a lot of agreement. And the way that we've typically characterized it, perhaps at times a little bit too strongly, is that Republicans are very much focused on these traditional, what we would call traditional security threats. They emanate from outside of the United States, and they can be dealt with in terms of military power. That's the world that Republicans live in, perhaps want to live in. It's probably a much simpler world. But when you look at the Democrats, it's a little bit different, right? They have these non-traditional security threats: COVID-19, climate change, racial inequality, which is a domestic issue, foreign interference. That speaks a little bit to the softness of the electoral system here, but also economic inequality is clearly a domestic issue in this case. And so, yeah, there's not a lot of agreement between the Republicans and Democrats, and I think we're going to see both of the candidates speak to that. Perhaps Biden more so, because at this point, it's unclear that Trump is actually trying to win any of the other voters that may be undecided. But my guess is that there are historically low numbers of undecided voters, given just how divisive these candidates are. But we've seen this division. So, Craig, I guess the question to you would be, where do we see overlap between the partisans?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, this is the division that we see in this question about threats is not something we've seen before. Usually there's at least some agreement on some of the top threats facing the country. This is an extremely unusual situation for us, and it's been an unusual year. That said, there are still some areas where we see pretty strong overlap on some of these really core foreign policy concerns. So we've been asking at the Council since our very first survey back in 1974, a question about whether the US should take an active part in the world or whether it should stay out of world affairs. And this year, 68% of Americans say, no, it's best for the future of the country to take an active part in world affairs. That's fairly consistent with data that we've seen in years past, really all the way back to the 1970s. And surprisingly, that didn't change despite the fact that there's been a global catastrophic pandemic this year. We were sort of expecting that that might affect Americans' openness to global engagement and some of these more internationalist attitudes that a lot of them hold. The other two areas where we see a lot of agreement are on US alliances in Europe, in East Asia, even in the Middle East. Americans are generally fond of alliances. They see them as a very effective way to achieve US foreign policy goals. They see them as beneficial both for the United States and for our allies in those regions, and both with regards to NATO in Europe and to some of our core allies in Asia, like South Korea and Japan. There's a strong appreciation for those alliances and a feeling that we should maintain or increase our commitment to them. And then Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, no, I was going to jump in to tee up another question for you, because you talked a little bit about the COVID-19 pandemic, and you're talking about where they're at on that. Can you talk also a little bit about the lessons that are being learned from the COVID-19 pandemic? Because I know that's also a point of distinction and difference that I think is important to understand, and we're going to hear a lot of that come out in the debate tonight.
Yeah, so this is another example where Republicans and Democrats are really operating from, I think, different starting assumptions, and they end up in very different places. So we asked this question about, what's the lesson of the coronavirus pandemic for the United States? Is it that we need to be more cooperative with other countries, that we should rely on other countries and work together to solve these global challenges? Or is it that the US needs to be more self-sufficient, that we can't rely on other countries, that we have to be able to do things for ourselves? And Democrats and Republicans, I think at their base, just think about that question very differently. Republicans see the US as needing to be more self-sufficient, as needing to be a strong country that does not need other countries. You see that in that question, but also in questions about military superiority. The US needs to be the strong country that can stand alone. They're less interested in international cooperation, in working through international institutions, in participating in international treaties. For Democrats, those international institutions and commitments, although binding on the US, and although may require the US to compromise, are also a source of strength for the US. So you end up in very different places. I mean, Carl, you spend a lot of time focusing on Asia specifically. I mentioned that there's a great deal of agreement about alliances in Asia. Is that true for some of these hotter issues like North Korea? Obviously, of all the foreign policy issues that Trump could tout as a success, one of them might be his efforts on the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah, the efforts on the Korean Peninsula are something that he's certainly going to sell tonight if it comes to that, if it comes up. Unfortunately for him, there's I think we've come to calling kind of photo op diplomacy. He gets away with going over there talking to Kim Jong-un directly. There are these big agreements that they sign. They don't really mean much. Kim Jong-un hasn't really committed to anything, but the way that the American public has interpreted this has been kind of interesting in that everyone has always assumed that, yeah, the American public doesn't really understand what's going on. There's a lot of skepticism towards polling. We should actually put a pin in that particular line about the skepticism towards polling. So I know you have thoughts on that. I have some thoughts on that. But we tend to think that, well, maybe the American public doesn't get it. So what do they think about North Korea? I was looking at the data this year, and I've come up with the three cannots. I have a friend who's actually on this call who has lived in Korea for a long time. He's joining us from Canada, so I'm hoping that he will get a kick out of this. Because in Korea, they have a thing about grouping things in threes, right? So if you go to Jeju Island on the south, it's like the three no's, and it's always these groups of threes. And the Americans seem to have three cannots. We cannot accept it. That is, cannot accept a North Korea with nuclear weapons. We cannot bomb it because the consequences are too severe if we do that, and we cannot negotiate it. That is, there's no real faith that this can be negotiated away. So on the North Korea, and that's pretty sophisticated understanding from the American public in a way that I would not really have expected. So there's the American public is certainly there. You look at things like South Korea. We've seen favorability towards South Korea basically at an all-time high. They see South Korea as a big fair trade partner. And I think the interesting thing is that a lot of these issues, whatever Trump has gone after a country, if he's criticized global trade, if he's criticized alliances, the public, even Republicans, have moved in the opposite direction. So when he comes out and criticizes, well, everyone's taking advantage of us, the public will move the opposite direction. Say, actually, maybe we actually like international trade. Maybe it is good for us. He criticizes alliances. Everyone comes back and says, well, actually, our alliances are pretty good. But the one place that I think we're starting to see some agreement, and I know you just wrote a brief on this, so I'll kick it over to you on China. It looks like he's taken a tough line on China, and it looks like there is not exact agreement, but Republicans and Democrats are moving in the same direction as the president, although at different speeds. So yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts on where the overlap comes specifically on China.
Yeah, China is an interesting case where the president has spent a lot of time and energy during his administration, mostly in fighting a trade war, which didn't seem to move public opinion very much. You did see Republicans favoring imposing tariffs on China, and Americans have, for over a decade, seen China as an unfair trading partner. But it hasn't really moved the needle on how the U.S. should approach China more generally. That is, until this year. And it seems like the combination of the pandemic and possibly some of the reporting of human rights abuses in Xinjiang and what's gone on in Hong Kong has finally moved the American public in a way that nothing else has. In our polling, we've seen opinion of China drop to its lowest levels in our polling history, which goes back to 1978, which gives you a sense of just how serious the crisis in public confidence in China is. We've seen Americans, particularly among Republicans, saying that the development of China as a world power is a critical threat to the U.S. For Republicans, 67% of them say that. It's the top on their list for threats. And you are now seeing a debate among the American public about whether the U.S. should pursue a policy of cooperation and engagement, which is what Democrats would favor, or a policy of trying to contain China's rise, which is much more popular with Republicans. And on specific policies, you do have some areas of agreement. There's broad support for human rights sanctions on some Chinese officials, on limiting the sorts of technology transfers that can go on, either U.S. firms selling high-tech goods to China or on Chinese telecom companies investing in the U.S. But beyond that, you still get some of those partisan disagreements. And they sort of come back to other areas like immigration. Republicans say that the U.S. should limit the number of Chinese students in the U.S., and Democrats oppose that. And that matches up pretty closely with where they are on immigration more generally. We are about to go into Q&A, so I do want to remind everybody, if you'd like to pose a question or comment on other people's questions, remember to go to ccga.live, and there you can put your name in, vote on questions, and ask us something.
I actually just flipped over to that in another tab, and I saw one of the very first questions was, let me flip over and read this so I get it right. Who is going to be most effective weaponizing facts and figures in tonight's debate? That's an interesting question because it brings up, a candidate's ability to recall facts and figures in tonight's debate. And I have one person that I think is going to do better because he has a history of, actually using facts and figures, and one person who lives in an alternate reality. So in terms of who's going to do, it's going to be most effective. The most effective part of that is doing a lot of work. Sorry, you're whoever posted that, you have to remember you're dealing with two people who work in polling a lot, and so we tend to overanalyze anything that is written as a question. So it depends on which part of that question wording you're going to focus on. But again, it's going to be two people speaking to their bases, right? There isn't. I can't imagine there are a large number of undecideds in this, and I really think that this is going to be a lot of, probably not unlike people here, there's going to be a lot of rage watching going on, a lot of yelling at the TV. And so I don't think that anyone's going to sway anyone else or anyone on the other side with tonight's debate performance.
Yeah, and after the mess that was the first debate, I'm not sure how many people will be willing to tune in for the experience of this second debate, even if there is a promise of greater stability, even if it is the last debate. The first one was not entirely a pleasant experience to go through. We do have some great questions in the chat, and one of them is hitting on that question that we decided we'd put a pin in for later. What happened in 2016? Why were the polls so wrong? And can we trust the polls this year? Carl, I know we both got thoughts. Carl?
So this has been an ongoing discussion for us, and I'll leave the accuracy of the poll question for you to deal with. I know but my big issue with all of this has been the move driven by 538, I think, but also followed on by others, is that now they release a probability of victory, right? So for example, hypothetically, let's say that you were given a poll that said candidate A has 51% in the poll and candidate B has 49% in the poll. Your expectation going in to the election would be that this is fairly close. Right, it's a 2 points here. That's you're looking at a tight electoral college potentially, and maybe not a toss-up, but it's a lean, or maybe, and if not a lean, a tilt. But when it comes to probability, these other models, they take the polls, they put in Google searches, they put in all these other things, and they make their own model, and then they spit out a number like 85% probability of candidate A victory, 90% probability of candidate A victory. That to me, I think sounds, and I think to the public, sounds much different than 51-49, right? And so if you look at that probability model saying, well, it's 90% chance, how were the polls so wrong? And that's because they're not only working from the polls, but even more disturbing to me is that the people who were producing these probability models, they never came up to take responsibility for that. Instead, they said, well, we told you there was a 10% chance that the opposite outcome could happen. Right? So they've kind of, in my opinion, kind of pushed off their own responsibility and are unwilling to deal with that. I have seen one pollster in particular really own up to it and say, yeah, this is probably not the best way to go about it. And I don't know about you, I haven't actually seen a lot of probability models out this year of the 75, 80, 95%. Maybe I've been ignoring them and just haven't seen them. But Craig, comments on the polling accuracy from 2016 and whether or not we can trust it this year?
Yeah, I think most of the probability models, or at least a number of them, did not decide to have a second go at it after 2016. Mostly the ones that were extremely confident in a Clinton victory. 538, of course, famously was the one that was the least wrong, with the highest percentage of a Trump win, which Nate Silver has reminded everyone of every chance he has gotten. There is, of course, also the economist model, which is also an open model, which is quite nice. So if you are so inclined and have the data chops for it, you can actually go digging through all of their code to figure out exactly how they're coming up with their estimates, which is a nice move of transparency on their part. Part of the issue was definitely probability. Humans in general are not good at dealing with probability. This is one of the reasons why casinos do well, because people are not good at odds. I think the odds right now are something like 1 in 7 that Trump would win, given where the polls are now, which would require a mix of shifts before Election Day and polling error and possibly something else. And 1 in 7 does not sound like much, but sort of a fun, well, maybe not fun thought experiment, but if you want to get a sense of how likely that is, pick a date, any date that you like, look at the calendar for 2021. If it is a Tuesday, congratulations, Trump has won. And that will give you a sense of how often that happens. In terms of the accuracy of the polls, I do think that a lot of lessons have been learned since 2016. One of the big problems in 2016 that led to some of these erroneous forecasts were state-level pollsters, particularly in the Midwest, who didn't weight their polls by education. You need to weight your polls because when you draw your sample, it doesn't always quite look like the population that you're trying to survey. That's natural. People respond to surveys at different rates, so you do need to adjust for it. The problem in 2016 is that if you don't weight by education, and education also happens to be a big predictor of vote likelihood and vote intention, then you can come up with some pretty erroneous state-level forecasts. It seems less likely that that's going to be a huge issue this year, though it is certainly possible. I can't rule it out. But I have greater confidence in the polls this year, perhaps given the updates that have been made since 2020 or since 2016.
Any other questions posted in the chat, or should we continue on?
We've got lots, actually. This is great. So the top one right now, in the topic of climate change, do you think Biden will be able to move away from the fracking issue? What other stats could Biden and Trump talk about as achievements?
So I have to admit, I follow mostly East Asia security stuff and foreign policy, so I'm probably not the best person to answer, moving away from the fracking stuff. But I think Biden's going to return to his vice presidential days of getting us into the Paris Climate Accord and the need to rejoin that. I expect him to hit Trump quite hard over his withdrawal from that and kind of the ability that's given from everyone else to essentially step out of that agreement following that and kind of doing whatever they want.
Yeah, and that's another issue where Biden is most likely going to be talking primarily to Democrats who care a lot about climate change. This is notably the first time in one of these debates that climate change has been a topic. It's something that climate activists have pressed pretty hard for. So they'll be excited to see what Biden has to say. It's something that they care a lot about and something that Democrats care a lot about. It's one of their top threats facing the country. Democrats have been increasingly likely to name climate change as a critical threat over the last decade. And it's particularly an issue that young people care about. In polls that focus on these slices of voters who are somewhat undecided, haven't quite made up their minds. Young voters seem to be the ones who really do care about climate in those polls.
I know this is maybe taking us off course. One thing we didn't actually talk about was, and I expect to actually see some of this tonight, is attitudes on domestic violent extremism. All right, so I showed that graphic a little bit earlier. This is one of, I think it's the second overall threat for the public overall, and this is something that Republicans and Democrats actually agree on. It's like a 3 or 5 point gap on the importance of domestic violent extremism as a critical threat, where when we look at things like immigration, we get 50-point gaps. This is one of the few areas where they overlap. But the key to this is that obviously, and I'm sure everyone watching this is thinking the exact same thing, that Republicans and Democrats define who and what is domestic violent extremism very differently about the groups that are perpetrating it, about who they would suspect of carrying it out. So I'll be looking for that as well. In the first debate, President Trump was given the option to disavow some of the white supremacy groups, and he did not do that. And so I wonder if Biden is going to bring that up again and really try to hammer him on that he couldn't say that he rejected the support of groups like the Proud Boys.
We've got time for a few more questions. We got about 5 minutes to go. Let's take on a polling one here. Why did the media still rely on exit polling when it's always been such a mess? My impression this year is that exit polling will not play much of a role in the news coverage of the election because of how many people are voting early. I'm not actually sure how you would do an exit poll that accounts for that, given that 47 million people have already voted, and the early vote totals are going to be enormous. Not to mention the logistical challenges of doing exit polling properly normally, added on to the fact that there's currently a pandemic going on. I wouldn't be surprised if exit polling plays a very little role in the media coverage this year.
It looks like we have about 4 minutes left. I wonder if we should spend some of those minutes, and maybe we can carry those other questions into the chat once that kicks off. But what are your expectations for tonight's debate? Right? Are you thinking about this? I mean, obviously, with the microphones being muted, it may not be as unwatchable as the first one. But I've got this working theory that who does the microphone muting actually benefit? And I almost wonder that if it benefits Trump in some way, because he's the one who made it unwatchable, and he'll have a chance to actually have the civility enforced upon him, where people will actually come away saying, well, actually, he can be an adult. He can kind of listen to this. So my expectation is, it's still not high for this debate overall, but I wonder what you're thinking about who's going to come out ahead, and who do you think will perform best in this?
It's possible that the muting will have the effect of sort of disciplining the president, which is a really odd thing to have to say. On the other hand, I think a more basic problem that he faces is that the questions are all going to be ones that are fairly difficult for him to answer. And that's not because the moderator is going to, go after him in particular, but as an incumbent president, he now has a record that he has to defend. And a lot of these questions about things like the coronavirus, about US national security, about the impact of the current recession on American families are not things that he has been able to answer in the past, even in non-debate formats. He recently walked out of an interview with 60 Minutes. If he can't handle a one-on-one interview in an environment that he's more comfortable with, I'm not convinced that he's going to be able to perform better in a debate setting. Debate settings are a thing that reward practice and they reward preparation. Joe Biden has been through many debates in his long political career. I have no doubt that he has prepared for this extensively, as he did for the first debate. I am skeptical that Trump will be coming in armed with a lot of facts and figures that are pointed at sort of everyday Americans. I expect it to be a lot more things that appeal to people who watch Fox News, which are an important part of his base, and he needs them to turn out to vote. But that is not a majority of the American public. He already has those people. If he's not going to appeal to other people, then he's not going to win this debate.
Yeah, and I think that's also something to keep in mind, that last point you made, that people who are watching some of Fox News, or we see this all the time, people who are carrying guns at polling places, or who are marching in the streets with guns, kind of as the anti-protesters. I think that it's really important to remember that is an incredibly small percentage of Americans overall, but they attract, I think, an inordinate amount of the media attention to make them seem like this much larger group. And so, he will be playing to that, no doubt. I think we all need to keep in mind that represents a fairly small percentage of Americans overall, and even a smaller percentage of his base as well.
Yeah, and this is something that, in our weekly and bi-weekly updates on public opinion and the pandemic that we've been writing for the council since February, I suppose, before it really got to the US. The percentage of Americans who favor a lot of these restrictions in support of health measures, wearing masks, social distancing, things like that, the percentage has always been quite high, much higher than you would expect given the balance of media coverage. The proportion of people who say they never wear masks when they go out is incredibly small. Although, to be fair, 2% of Americans is not a small number of people. That is, several large stadiums full of people. If they all get together and protest, it does make quite a scene. But it's not going to win you an election. All right, we are at 7:45. I do want to give everyone time to get their pre-debate snacks and get settled on the couch for what should be an interesting evening. Please do stay with us here at ccga.live. If we didn't get to your question during the live conversation, we can probably answer it by text.
Yeah.
Thanks to everyone who did tune in to the debate primer. As a reminder, a recording of this will also be available on the council's website shortly, and we'll share it out on our social channels. As I said, you'll be able to continue to weigh in on the debate topics and share your reactions to the debate itself on ccga.live. With that, I'll see you on there. Good night and good luck.